The stale, cold air of the tiny city apartment was a physical weight on Liam's shoulders. At 42, he was a carpenter, a man who built things, yet his own life was in a state of total collapse. The scent of dust and day-old coffee hung in the silence, a silence broken only by the distant, mournful wail of sirens, painting a picture of a city that didn't care. He felt his heart squeezed tight in his chest, a familiar, agonizing pressure. It had been 6 months since his wife. Maria had lost her long, expensive battle with illness, and the grief was still a raw, open wound. But it was the shame that was truly eating him alive. It was a constant, gnawing hunger in the pit of his stomach, a cold dread that crept up his spine every time he looked at his daughter. His hands, once strong and calloused from a lifetime of honest work, were now soft, idle, a testament to his failure. He stared at the red ink of the eviction notice taped to the door. It felt less like a warning and more like a final judgment. He sat at the worn kitchen table, the wood scarred with the history of a life that no longer existed. He tipped the contents of an old jam jar onto the table's surface. The metallic clink of the coins was a pathetic sound, a soundtrack to his ruin. He meticulously counted them, his fingers trembling slightly. $287.15. He said the number aloud, his voice a dry rasp. 287.15. That was everything, all that stood between him and the street, between his daughter and the horrors of homelessness. A stack of bills sat beside the small pile of money, a tower of final notices and threats written in cold, corporate language. The medical debt was a mountain he could never hope to climb, a cruel monument to his powerlessness. He felt the familiar rise of nausea in his throat. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the promise he had made to Maria, a promise to protect their child, a promise he was spectacularly failing to keep. From the other room, a small, sweet sound floated through the suffocating quiet. It was his 10-year-old daughter, Sophia, humming a tune as she drew in her notepad. A wave of love so fierce it was painful washed over Liam, immediately followed by a tidal wave of guilt that threatened to drown him. He felt his throat tighten, the burn of unshed tears behind his eyes. He looked at her worn-out sneakers by the door, a small hole forming over the big toe. He saw her, lost in a world of colored pencils, drawing a picture of a little house with a big green yard and a tire swing, a dream he knew he could never give her. "Daddy, what's for dinner?" she called out, her voice bright with an innocence that shattered his heart. He forced a smile, the muscles in his face feeling stiff and alien. "A surprise, sweetie," he managed to say, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. The surprise was the same watery soup they'd had for the last 3 nights. At night, the silence was the worst. It was a living entity, filled with the ghost of Maria's laughter. He'd lie in the cold bed, the space beside him a vast empty expanse, and swear he could still smell the faint, floral scent of her perfume on the pillow he couldn't bring himself to wash. The grief wasn't a memory. It was a constant companion, a heavy cloak he wore day and night. It was in the taste of his food, the air he breathed, the hollow echo of his own footsteps in the apartment. Every bill that arrived felt like a fresh wound, a reminder that not only had he failed to save her, but her death had also chained him to a lifetime of debt. He would run his thumb over the cool glass of her picture on the nightstand, her smile a beacon from a life he no longer recognized. "Take care of our Sophia," she had whispered with her last breath. The words haunted him. They were a sacred vow that he was desecrating with every passing moment of his failure. The shrill ring of the phone sliced through the gloom. It was the landlord. The voice on the other end was flat, devoid of pity. "End of the week, Liam. No more excuses." Click. The line went dead. The finality of it sent a jolt of pure panic through him. He felt the walls of the small apartment begin to close in, the air growing thin and heavy. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. He looked over at Sophia, who had fallen asleep on the threadbare couch, her small chest rising and falling in the gentle rhythm of innocent dreams. A fierce, primal resolve suddenly burned through the fog of his despair. The gnawing shame was replaced by a cold, hard determination. He would not let her fall. He would not let the world break her. His world had been reduced to a single, terrifying imperative: survive. He had less than 72 hours to find a miracle, or they would be devoured. What would you do in his place and with everything on the line and the clock ticking towards disaster? It was in the suffocating darkness of 3 a.m. lit only by the cold, sterile glow of his phone screen, that the miracle appeared. Liam's eyes burned, gritty from lack of sleep, his thumb swiping numbly past jobs he was unqualified for, jobs that paid too little, jobs that were already gone. The silence of the apartment pressed in, amplifying the sound of his own ragged breathing and the frantic, desperate thumping of his heart. Every shadow in the room seemed to mock him, whispering of his failure. He was scrolling through a bottom-feeder job site, the last resort for the desperate when a small Char's text-only ad caught his eye. The letters seemed to hum with a strange energy, a tiny pinprick of light in his all-consuming darkness. He felt a jolt, not of hope, but of pure, unadulterated curiosity. It was different. It was a lifeline thrown into a churning sea of debt and despair, and his hands, trembling, reached for it as if it were the only solid thing left in his world. He read the words again and again, letting them sink in. The ad was simple, almost suspiciously so. Live-in caretaker needed for rural property renovation, Fazenda Sombra Verde. The name, Green Shadow Farm, sent a strange, faint chill down his spine, but he ignored it. The description was vague, posted by a holding company with a generic name, SV Holdings. There was no phone number, only an email address. The ad promised a modest salary, enough to buy food and essentials, but it was the other two words that made his breath catch in his throat. Free lodging. Free lodging. The words were a prayer answered. It was a chance to escape the city, to escape his creditors, to put a solid roof over Sophia's head, even if it was a temporary one. A flicker of hope, the first he had felt in months, ignited in his chest. It was a fragile, tentative flame, but it was enough to push back the darkness. Just for a moment, he thought of Sophia's drawing of a house in the country. Maybe, just maybe, this was the universe giving them a chance, a way out of the concrete cage that was crushing them both. He typed out a short, desperate email with fumbling fingers, his carpentry skills useless in a world that ran on keyboards and connections he didn't have. He didn't expect a reply, but less than an hour later, his phone buzzed. An email from SV Holdings. It was brief, impersonal, asking for a single phone call. The voice on the other end was clipped and businesslike. A man who didn't waste words. There were no questions about his past, no background check, no references. It was as if they simply needed a body, any body, to fill the role. The job is yours if you can be there by the end of the week, the voice said flatly. Liam's heart leaped. Yes, he stammered. Yes, absolutely. When he hung up, a wave of dizzying relief washed over him, so powerful it made him weak at the knees. He had done it. He had saved them. He didn't stop to question the strangeness of it all. He didn't care. The fragile flame of hope in his chest roared into a bonfire. He finally had a plan. He finally had a future, or at least the beginning of one. The next 2 days were a blur of frantic activity. They packed their meager lives into 2 large suitcases and a handful of cardboard boxes. The sound of packing tape being stretched and torn was the sound of escape. Sophia, sensing the shift in the oppressive atmosphere, was giddy with excitement. "Are we going on an adventure, Daddy?" she asked, her eyes wide. Liam felt a sharp pang of guilt. He was selling her a dream based on a few lines of text from a stranger. "The biggest adventure ever," he replied, forcing a cheerfulness into his voice that he didn't feel. He sold his tools, the symbols of his former life, for a pittance, just enough to buy 2 one-way bus tickets. As he handed over his favorite handplane, its wooden handle worn smooth by his own grip, he felt a piece of himself die. But he pushed the feeling down. It was a sacrifice, a necessary one. He was no longer a carpenter. He was a survivor. And for the first time in a long time, as he taped the final box shut, he felt the crushing weight on his shoulders lighten, just a little. The bus journey was a long, grinding purgatory. The constant, low drone of the diesel engine vibrated through the floor, a monotonous hum that seeped into Liam's bones. The air was thick with the smell of stale air freshener and the faint scent of sweat from dozens of tired bodies. He sat hunched in the sticky vinyl seat, staring out the window as the grey, monolithic towers of the city gave way to sprawling suburbs, and then, finally, to an endless, rolling expanse of green. Sophia, after an hour of excited chatter, had fallen asleep, her head resting on his arm. Her small, warm weight, was a comforting anchor in the dizzying swirl of his thoughts. He felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if he were traveling between two different worlds. He was running away from debt, from grief, from the ghost of his wife that haunted every corner of their tiny apartment. But as the miles stretched on, a new feeling began to creep in, a cold, nagging anxiety. He was running towards something completely unknown. After 8 hours, they changed buses in a noisy, chaotic depot. The new bus was smaller, older, and rattled violently on the increasingly rough roads. The pavement soon gave way to packed dirt, and the lush green landscape became wilder, more untamed. The air that blew through the open windows was no longer fresh. It was heavy, humid, and thick with the smell of damp earth and rotting vegetation. Liam felt his collar grow damp with sweat. The few other passengers were silent, weathered locals who gave him brief, incurious glances. He felt like an outsider, an intruder in a world that was not his own. The fragile hope he had nurtured began to feel brittle, thin as glass. With every jarring bump and lurch of the bus, a piece of it seemed to chip away. The isolation was no longer a promise of freedom. It was beginning to feel like a threat. He clutched Sophia's small hand in his own palm slick with a nervous sweat. The bus was taking them further and further away from everything they knew. Finally, the bus shuddered to a halt in the middle of nowhere. Fazenda Sombra Verde Crossroads. The driver grunted, not even turning around. Liam and Sophia stepped off the bus and into a wall of oppressive heat. The bus pulled away, leaving them standing in a cloud of swirling red dust. And then silence, an absolute, deafening silence, punctuated only by the shrill, electric hum of insects he couldn't see. The road stretched in both directions, a dusty red scar through a sea of impenetrable green. There were no cars, no houses, no signs of life, just a single, rust-eaten metal signpost tilted at a drunken angle. One rusted arrow pointed down a narrow, overgrown dirt track. The faded, peeling letters read, Fazenda Sombra Verde. They were completely and utterly alone. A knot of cold dread began to form in the pit of Liam's stomach. This wasn't peaceful. This was empty. He looked at Sophia, whose face had lost its excited glow, now clouded with confusion. "Are we here?" she asked, and her voice small. The walk down the dirt track felt endless. The sun beat down relentlessly, and the air was so thick with humidity it felt like breathing water. Liam's shirt was soaked through with sweat within minutes. He dragged the heavy suitcase, its wheels useless on the rutted earth, while Sophia trailed behind. Her initial excitement having completely evaporated into weary complaint. "My feet hurt, Daddy. How much farther is it?" Liam didn't have any answers. The path was flanked by a dense, menacing wall of vegetation. The sweet, cloying smell of unfamiliar flowers mingled with an underlying scent he couldn't place, a smell of decay, of things left to rot. His earlier relief now felt like a foolish, childish fantasy. His heart began to pound with a slow, heavy rhythm of anxiety. Every snap of a twig in the undergrowth made him jump. He felt watched. He felt like they were walking into a trap, and he was the one who had led his daughter straight into it. And then he saw it. Through a break in the trees, the main house came into view, and Liam's heart didn't just sink, it plummeted. It was a spectre, a skeletal ruin silhouetted against the unforgiving blue sky. The farmhouse was a corpse. The promises of the ad, the modest salary, the free lodging, all of it evaporated into a cruel joke. A wave of nausea rose in his throat. He had dragged his daughter hundreds of miles for this, for a pile of rotting wood and crumbling stone. This wasn't a renovation project, it was a demolition site. He felt the bonfire of hope he had so carefully built inside him be extinguished in an instant, leaving behind only the cold, black ash of despair. He had failed again, more spectacularly than he could have ever imagined. He had escaped one prison only to walk willingly into a far more desolate and far more isolated one. Sophia stopped beside him, her small hand gripping his. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The silence was filled with his monumental failure. As they got closer, the full scale of the decay became horrifyingly clear. The roof had partially collapsed in the center, leaving a jagged, gaping hole open to the sky. Most of the windows were gone, shattered into nothing, leaving behind dark, vacant eyes that stared out blindly at the overgrown landscape. The wind, picking up as the afternoon wore on, whistled through these empty holes, creating a low, mournful moaning sound, like the house itself was in pain. Liam felt a cold shiver trace its way down his spine, despite the suffocating heat. The building looked like it had been violently attacked, not just neglected. He felt his stomach twist into a tight, painful knot. The man on the phone, the vague company, the lack of questions, it all made a terrible kind of sense now. They hadn't been looking for a caretaker. They had been looking for a fool. And they had found one. He stood frozen before the wreck, the weight of his gullibility crushing him. He put down the suitcase, his hand feeling numb, and pushed on what was left of the massive front door. It swung inward with a prolonged, agonizing screech of rusted hinges that echoed through the derelict structure. And then the smell hit him. It was a physical force, a thick, gagging miasma that clawed at the back of his throat. Mold, pervasive, suffocating mold. And beneath it, the damp, earthy scent of decay, of wet, rotting wood, and the faint, putrid smell of dead animals. The air was heavy and stagnant, tasting of ruin and long-forgotten time. Liam instinctively put an arm in front of Sophia, shielding her as if from a physical blow. He felt his throat tighten, the urge to retch overwhelming him. This wasn't just a smell. It was the scent of death, the death of a home, the death of a dream. And now, the death of his last on desperate hope. He took a hesitant step inside, into the gloom, and the sound of his footstep on the grimy floor seemed unnaturally loud in the tomb-like silence. The interior was a nightmare. Thin shafts of dusty light pierced the darkness, illuminating a scene of total devastation. Plaster hung from the walls in long, peeling strips, revealing the rotting wooden lath beneath like exposed ribs. The floorboards, warped and stained, groaned and creaked ominously under his weight, threatening to give way at any moment. In one corner, a pile of debris lay where the ceiling had fallen in, and he could see the skeletal remains of a small animal, probably a rat, half buried in the rubble. Dark, ugly water stains snaked down the walls from the gaping holes in the roof, looking like weeping, black veins. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the disrepair was a prison far more terrifying than the debt he had fled. There was no renovating this. This place needed to be burned to the ground. He felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in his chest, a laugh born of pure, unadulterated despair. He had promised Sophia an adventure, and he had brought her to a tomb. He stumbled back outside, gasping for fresh air, his lungs burning. He had to find the lodging, the shack. It had to be better. It had to be. He saw it a short distance from the main house, half hidden by overgrown weeds. It was a single, tiny room, constructed of rough, unpainted planks, many of which were warped or missing. The door hung crookedly from a single rusted hinge. He pushed it open and his heart broke. The inside was even worse. A leaky roof had allowed years of rain to pour in, and a steady, maddening drip, plink, 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 fell from a dark hole in the ceiling into a green, scummy puddle on the packed dirt floor. In one corner sat a rusty metal cot with a thin, mouldy mattress. That was it. No electricity, no water, no toilet. This wasn't lodging. It was a hovel, unfit for an animal, let alone a child. This was their new home. The finality of it hit him like a punch to the gut, knocking the air from his lungs. He turned and saw Sophia standing in the doorway, her small face streaked with dirt and tears. She wasn't wailing. She wasn't throwing a tantrum. She was crying with the quiet, devastating hopelessness of a child who has finally understood the full extent of a parent's failure. The sound of her soft, choked sobs was a physical pain, a blade twisting in Liam's chest. He had done this to her. He had stripped away her home, her security, her last shreds of childhood innocence, and brought her to this desolate hell. The guilt was a tidal wave, pulling him under into a dark abyss of self-loathing. He wanted to scream. He wanted to smash his fists against the rotting walls until his knuckles were bloody. He wanted to rewind time, to go back to the city, to face the eviction, to face anything but this. This was a new bottom, a depth of failure and despair he never knew existed. He had nothing left, no money, no home, no hope, only his daughter, whose heart he had just broken. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, it set the sky ablaze with breathtaking streaks of orange, purple, and fiery red. The stunning, almost violent beauty of the sunset was a cruel mockery, throwing the skeletal ruin of the farmhouse and the pathetic shack into sharp, dark relief. As darkness fell, it didn't just get quiet. The silence was replaced by a cacophony of new sounds. The chirps, clicks, and rustles of the jungle seemed to press in from all sides, a living, breathing entity that surrounded their tiny, fragile island of despair. The isolation was no longer a concept. It was a terrifying, physical presence. Liam pulled Sophia close, her small body trembling against his. He felt a cold, primal fear, unlike anything he had ever known. They were trapped, miles from help, with no way back and no way forward. The false hope had been a mirage, and now that it was gone, he could see the truth clearly. He wasn't a survivor. He was a ghost haunting the ruins of his own life. The first few days at Fazenda Sombra Verde were a slow, grinding torture of the soul. The initial shock of the ruin had subsided, leaving behind a dull, persistent ache of hopelessness that was far worse. Liam and Sophia subsisted on the last of their packaged food, their world reduced to the leaky shack and the menacing silhouette of the decaying house. The nights were the worst, filled with the alien sounds of the jungle and the maddening, rhythmic plink, plink, plink of water dripping onto the dirt floor. Liam felt his identity as a builder, a provider, being stripped away, layer by layer, leaving only a hollow man. He would watch Sophia draw in the dirt with a stick, her face devoid of the joy it once held, and the guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on him, suffocating him. He knew he couldn't let them simply waste away. He had to do something, anything. He had to fight back against the decay, even if it was a futile gesture. A flicker of his old self, the carpenter, refused to die. Driven by this desperate need to act, he decided to start clearing the main house. Not to renovate it, that was impossible, but to reclaim a single room from the ruin, a space that was dry and safe for Sophia. He chose a room off the main hall that seemed to have been a study. It was smaller, and the roof above it, while damaged, hadn't completely collapsed. The air was thick with the dust of ages, a fine grey powder that coated every surface. The scent of mold was less pronounced here, replaced by the dry, papery smell of decaying books and forgotten things. He began by clearing the fallen plaster and rotten wood, his bare hands quickly becoming raw and blistered. The work was mindless and grueling, but it was work. It was purpose. For the first time in days, he felt the ghost of his former strength return to his arms, a small rebellion against the overwhelming despair that had consumed him. He focused his energy on one wall in particular, a large expanse of plaster that was more crack than surface. It was this wall that seemed to mock him the most, its surface a map of a house's slow death. He needed a tool, something with weight. He found a heavy, solid piece of oak floorboard, torn from another room, its end jagged and splintered. It felt clumsy and alien in his hand, a crude mockery of the balanced hammers he had once wielded. He swung it against the crumbling plaster. The impact was a dull, unsatisfying thud, and a cloud of choking white dust erupted, making him cough. He swung again, harder this time, fueled by a surge of frustration. This time, the sound was different, not a thud, but a sharp, clean crack, followed by a hollow boom that seemed to echo in a way that was fundamentally wrong. He felt the vibration travel up the wood and into his arm. A large, dinner-plate-sized chunk of plaster fell away, revealing not the expected wooden lath or stone, but a void. A deep, unnatural darkness stared back at him from within the wall. His heart gave a sudden, hard jolt in his chest. A strange, cool draft immediately began to whisper from the newly created hole. He leaned closer, his nose wrinkling. The draft carried a scent that was different from the rest of the house. It wasn't the smell of damp mold or rot. It was the scent of a place that had been sealed for a very long time, a dry, sterile smell of ancient dust and something else, something he couldn't quite place, something faintly metallic and inorganic. He put his eye to the hole, but could see nothing but impenetrable blackness. The carpenter in him, the part of him that understood how houses were built, how they lived and breathed, was screaming that this was wrong. A wall like this, in a house of this era, shouldn't have such a cavity. A cold shiver, completely unrelated to the draft, traced a path down his sweat-soaked back. This wasn't damage. This wasn't decay. This felt intentional. The despair that had been his constant companion for days was suddenly replaced by a sharp, electrifying curiosity. His knuckles were white as he gripped the makeshift club. He moved a few feet to the side of the hole and tapped the wall lightly with the end of the board. A low, hollow thump answered him. He moved again, thump, and again, thump. The entire wall, from floor to ceiling, from one corner of the room to the other, was hollow. He felt his breath catch in his throat. It was a false wall, a facade, deliberately constructed in front of the original stone wall of the house to create a hidden space. The realization sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through his veins, a feeling so potent it made his head spin. Who would do this, and why? The question hammered in his mind, drowning out the sounds of the jungle, drowning out the drip in the shack, drowning out everything but the pounding of his own heart. For a fleeting moment, he was no longer a failed father or a desperate man. He was an explorer on the verge of a profound discovery, standing before a door no one knew existed. He had to see what was inside. The need was primal, overwhelming. He dropped the oaken board and began to attack the wall with his bare hands, his fingers finding purchase in the cracks around the hole. The old plaster crumbled easily, raining down in a cascade of white dust and debris. But beneath it was a network of wooden lath, old and brittle but still clinging stubbornly to the frame. He worked frantically, pulling and tearing, the wood splintering and sending sharp slivers into his palms, but he barely felt the pain. He was a man possessed, driven by an instinct he didn't understand. Sophia appeared in the doorway, her small face a mixture of fear and awe as she watched her father tear the house apart. "Daddy, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice a small whisper. "I don't know, sweetie," he panted, his lungs burning. I think I'm finding something." He worked with renewed frenzy, ripping away a large section of lath and plaster. Finally, a section large enough for him to see came free, crashing to the floor in a cloud of dust. He leaned forward, panting, and peered into the darkness. The void was real. It was a hidden compartment, about 2 feet deep, running the entire length and height of the wall. The back of the compartment was the original, rough-hewn stone of the old farmhouse, but the space itself was not empty. He felt his heart leap into his throat. He reached for his phone, his fingers trembling so badly he almost dropped it. He fumbled with the screen, his thumbs slick with sweat, and switched on the flashlight. He aimed the bright, cold LED beam into the darkness, the light cutting a sharp cone through decades of absolute blackness. The beam swept across the void, and what it revealed made him gasp. It wasn't a random collection of junk. It was organized. Stacks of something, all neatly arranged, were packed tightly into the space. The sight was so impossible, so out of place, that his mind struggled to comprehend it. The compartment was filled with dozens of parcels, each one carefully wrapped in what looked like dark, heavy oilcloth, the kind used to waterproof materials on old ships. They were tied with thick twine that had grown dark and brittle with age. The packages were of varying sizes, but all were rectangular, and they had been stacked with a careful, methodical precision. They were all coated in a thick, uniform layer of pale grey dust, a silent testament to the immense passage of time since they were last seen by human eyes. And there, sitting atop one of the central stacks, distinct from the others, was a single metal box. It was dark, possibly painted black, and its surface was filmed with the same grime that covered everything else. It was a lockbox, solid and severe. A cold dread mixed with the electrifying excitement. This was a deliberate cache, a hoard. Something someone had gone to enormous lengths to hide and to protect, and they had succeeded, until now. His hand shook as he reached through the hole and into the cold, still air of the compartment. He hesitated for a moment, a sudden wave of fear washing over him. What if this was a trap? What if he was disturbing something he shouldn't? He glanced back at Sophia, her wide, trusting eyes fixed on him. The sight of her shattered his fear. He had nothing left to lose. His life was already a ruin. What further danger could possibly matter? He resolved himself, and his fingers made contact with the closest parcel. The oilcloth was stiff, coldy, and crackled like old leather under his touch. He hooked his fingers under the twine and carefully, slowly, began to slide the package toward him. It was heavy, shockingly heavy. The density was unnatural, and it took all his strength to lift it from its resting place and pull it through the hole into the dim light of the study. He knelt on the dusty floor, the mysterious, heavy object resting before him. He placed the parcel on the floorboards, which groaned under the unexpected weight. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. He looked at the twine. It was so old, so fragile. He tugged at the knot, and it didn't unravel. It simply disintegrated into a puff of dark brown dust. With a sense of reverence and dread, he began to unfold the stiff, cracking layers of oilcloth. The material fought him, stiff with age, but he worked it open, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He peeled back the final layer. For a moment, his brain couldn't process what he was seeing. The object inside was rectangular, about the size of a brick, and it glowed. It wasn't a bright, reflective shine, but a soft, deep, buttery yellow luster that seemed to absorb the dim light of the room and radiate it back with its own inner warmth. He had seen this color before, in jewelry, in pictures, but never like this, never so pure, so solid, so real. It was a gold bar, a solid bar of pure gold. The realization hit him not as a thought, but as a physical shock, a lightning bolt that shot through his entire body, making his knees weak and stealing the air from his lungs. He stared, mesmerized, at the impossible object lying on the floor of the ruined house. This couldn't be real. It had to be a dream, a hallucination brought on by hunger and despair. He extended a trembling finger and touched its surface. The metal was cool, smooth, and impossibly dense. It was real. His finger traced the symbols that had been stamped crudely into the top. An eagle, its wings spread wide in a posture of imperial dominance, and clutched in its talons the jagged, terrifying shape of a swastika. He recoiled as if he'd been burned. This wasn't just gold. This was Nazi gold. The words echoed in his mind, a whisper from the darkest chapters of history. A wave of nausea and vertigo washed over him. This treasure wasn't a blessing. It was a curse. His terrified gaze snapped from the eagle on the gold bar back to the dark hole in the wall, to the black metal lockbox still resting on its dusty throne. The gold was a horrifying question, but the box might hold the answers. The story. His body moved on autopilot, his shock giving way to a desperate, urgent need to know. He reached back into the wall, his hands no longer trembling but moving with a grim purpose. He pulled the lockbox out. It was heavier than it looked, made of thick-gauge steel. It felt cold and dead in his hands. The lock was simple but strong, a heavy-duty clasp with a keyhole plugged with decades of dust. He didn't have the key. He didn't need it. He grabbed a tire iron he'd salvaged from an abandoned, rusted-out truck chassis he'd found in the woods, a piece of junk that had suddenly become the most important tool in the world. He wedged the tip into the seam of the lid. He put his full weight onto the tire iron, his muscles straining, his teeth gritted. The metal of the box groaned in protest, a low, scraping sound that set his teeth on edge. For a moment, nothing happened. He pushed harder, a desperate grunt escaping his lips. Then, with a sudden, violent shriek of tortured metal, the lock mechanism burst. The snap was as loud as a gunshot in the tomb-like silence of the house. Sophia jumped and let out a small cry. Liam barely noticed. He tossed the tire iron aside and knelt before the box. He took a deep, shuddering breath, a futile attempt to calm the frantic pounding of his heart. Then, with an unsteady hand, he slowly, carefully, lifted the lid. The hinges creaked, a final weary sigh from the past. The contents were revealed, and a new scent, entirely different from the gold or the dust, rose to meet him. It was the dry, academic smell of old paper and decaying leather, the smell of secrets. Inside, resting on a bed of faded, moth-eaten burgundy velvet, lay two items. The first was a thick, leather-bound book, its dark brown cover cracked and faded with age. On the front, initials were embossed in a severe Germanic script, H.W. It was a diary. Beside it lay a thick manila folder, bulging with yellowed documents. The paper was brittle, the edges browned and crumbling. It was held together by a rubber band that had long since lost its elasticity, having petrified into a stiff, brittle loop around the sheaf of papers. He picked up the diary first. The leather felt cold and alien in his hand. He opened it. The pages were filled with dense, elegant handwriting, a spidery script in a language he recognized as German, though he couldn't read a word of it. He set it aside and picked up the folder. He carefully slid the petrified rubber band off, and it snapped into several pieces. He unfolded the top document. It was a financial ledger, with columns of names, dates, and figures, all from the early 1950s. He had found the treasure, and now he had found its ledger. The story was here, waiting to be read. The hours after the discovery passed in a blur of cold, stomach-churning fear. Liam sat on the edge of the rusty cot in the shack, the single gold bar wrapped in an old rag, its dense weight a constant, terrifying reminder on the dirt floor beside him. The diary and the documents were spread out on the thin, mouldy mattress, in the oppressive humidity of the Brazilian night, punctuated by the relentless chirping of unseen insects. He used his phone. The translation app was slow, clumsy. He held the phone's camera over the spidery German script and fractured. Horrifying words materialized on the cold glass screen. Jüdisches Gold, Jewish gold, Ladung, cargo, Reinigung, cleansing. Each word was a punch to the gut. He felt a wave of dizziness. The small, glowing screen, the only point of light in his rapidly shrinking world. He was no longer just a man in a ruined farmhouse. He was the keeper of a terrible secret, a ghost story written in ink and blood, and he could feel its icy fingers closing around his throat, pulling him down into its dark history. He forced himself to keep reading, to keep translating, piecing together the nightmare. The diary belonged to a man named Horst Werner, an SS Obersturmbannführer, a high-ranking officer in Hitler's regime. The entries, written with a chilling, detached clarity, detailed his escape from a collapsing Germany in 1945. He wrote of U-boats and secret ports, of a network of sympathizers called the Kameradenwerk. The gold was not his. It was confiscated assets. A clinical, monstrous euphemism for the life savings, the wedding rings, the gold fillings torn from the mouths of families sent to the gas chambers. Liam felt a thick, sour bile rise in his throat. He looked at the gold bar, its soft glow now appearing sinister, demonic. It wasn't a treasure. It was the condensed misery of thousands of souls, a monument to a crime so vast it was almost incomprehensible. The air in the shack felt heavy, thin, as if the ghosts of the past were sucking all the oxygen from the room, leaving him to suffocate on their story. The diary then shifted to Brazil in the early 1950s. Horst Werner described the purchase of this vast, remote tract of land, calling it a perfect, isolated sanctuary. But the ledger told a more brutal story. Liam cross-referenced a name from the diary, a local family name, Da Silva, with the financial documents. He found a page with a list of names, and next to them single-word entries. Unfall, accident, verschwunden, disappeared, Widerstand, resistance. He felt a cold dread crawl up his spine, a serpent of pure terror coiling in his stomach. The officer hadn't bought the land, he had taken it. This place, Fazenda Sombra Verde, hadn't just been abandoned. It had been cleansed. The nausea returned, stronger this time. He imagined the families who had lived here, worked this land for generations, their lives erased by this man and his blood money. He was living inside a mass grave, a monument to a forgotten atrocity, paid for with the loot of a genocide. The weight of this knowledge was physical, crushing. A later entry from the 1970s during Brazil's military dictatorship was the final, devastating piece. Horst described his son, a man named Klaus, who now went by a Brazilian name, a lawyer. The diary boasted of how the gold was used, bar by bar, to bribe officials, to forge documents, to legalize the stolen land, erasing its bloody history under a mountain of corrupt bureaucracy. The holding company that had hired him, SV Holdings, suddenly made a sickening kind of sense. Sombra Verde Holdings. It was all connected. It was a single, unbroken chain of evil stretching from the ashes of Auschwitz to this very shack. Liam felt his entire body go cold. He wasn't a caretaker. He was a pawn in the final act of a 70-year-old crime. He had been brought here for a reason, but what? To be a convenient witness, or a convenient victim? The paranoia was a fever in his blood, and every rustle of leaves outside sounded like approaching footsteps, like the past coming to finally close its account. He stared at his sleeping daughter, her face so peaceful in the dim light. The innocence of her sleep was a stark, brutal contrast to the filth he had uncovered. This gold hound, this curse, could be their salvation. It was enough money to disappear, to give Sophia the life she deserved, a life free from poverty and fear. But it was blood money. The thought of using it, of building a future on a foundation of such profound suffering, made him feel physically ill. Yet, what was the alternative? To leave it? To pretend he'd never found it? The secret was a living thing now, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that it wouldn't stay buried. He was entangled, trapped. He had stumbled into a story that was not his, and he had a terrifying feeling that the story's rightful owners knew he was here. He felt his heart hammer against his ribs, a frantic, panicked rhythm. He was no longer just fighting poverty. He was fighting a monster with a history 70 years long and infinitely deep. It was then that a new sound cut through the night, a sound so alien and out of place, it made Liam jolt to his feet, his blood turning to ice. It wasn't the chittering of insects or the call of a night bird. It was the low, powerful rumble of a high-performance engine, growing steadily closer. A car, a modern, expensive car, tearing down the overgrown dirt track that led to the farm. Panic, pure and undiluted, seized him. His mind screamed, They know you found it." His movements became frantic, desperate. He scrambled to gather the diary and the documents, his fingers clumsy and slick with sweat. He shoved them into the metal lockbox. The sound of the engine was much closer now, a predatory growl in the darkness. He grabbed the single gold bar, its weight a terrifying anchor, and slid it and the box deep under the rickety cot, kicking dirt and leaves over them. The car's headlights swept across the shack, blinding him for a second as it came to a stop. The engine cut out, plunging the world into a sudden, deafening silence. The car door opened and closed with a soft, expensive thump. In the silvery moonlight, Liam could see the silhouette of a man standing by a sleek and black sedan. The man was tall, impeccably dressed in a dark suit that seemed to absorb the light. He stood for a moment, surveying the ruin of the main house with a proprietary air, his posture exuding a quiet, unnerving confidence. Liam felt his throat go dry as dust. He recognized the voice instantly, even before the man spoke. It was the clipped, businesslike tone from the phone call. The man who had hired him, the man from SV Holdings. A cold, sickening realization washed over Liam. He wasn't just facing a representative of the company. Given what he had just read in the diary, he was almost certainly staring at the son of Horst Werner, the heir to the entire horrifying legacy. The monster had come home, and Liam was standing right in the middle of its lair, his heart pounding a desperate, silent alarm against his ribs. The man walked toward the shack, his expensive leather shoes making soft, uncrunching sounds on the gravelly dirt. He moved with a calm, deliberate slowness that was more menacing than any overt threat. He stopped a few feet from the doorway, his face now visible. He was in his late 60s, with perfectly coiffed silver hair, a smoothly shaven jaw, and cold, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He offered a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. It was a thin, predatory slash in his handsome face. "Mr. Costa, I presume," he said, his Portuguese smooth and educated. "Dr. Alves, I was in the area and thought I'd come and see how you were settling in. A personal inspection." The words were polite, professional, but Liam felt a primal fear grip him. The man's gaze flickered past Liam, into the dark, pathetic interior of the shack, a flicker of undisguised contempt in his eyes. He knew. Liam was sure of it. This wasn't an inspection. It was a summons, a quiet, terrifying assertion of power. "The place is in worse shape than our records indicated," Dr. Alves continued, his tone casual, conversational, but his eyes were sharp, analytical, scanning everything. They swept over the main house, then the grounds, then came to rest on Liam with an unnerving intensity. "A much bigger project than we anticipated." He gestured vaguely toward the main house. "Have you started clearing the interior? I'm particularly interested in the state of the old study. That part of the foundation has always been problematic." The casual mention of the study sent a jolt of electricity through Liam's veins. It was too specific, too pointed. Liam felt the blood drain from his face, and he struggled to keep his voice steady, to stop it from trembling. "I've only just started clearing the debris," he managed to say, the lie feeling clumsy and obvious in his mouth. He could feel Dr. Alves's eyes on him, probing, searching, and he knew that the man could sense his fear. It hung in the air between them, thick and palpable. Dr. Alves's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer, before he turned and walked toward the main house, expecting Liam to follow. Liam's feet felt like lead, but he forced himself to move, to play the part of the compliant employee. They entered the ruin, the smell of mold and decay seeming to intensify in the doctor's presence, a stark contrast to the faint, expensive scent of his cologne. Alves walked with an unnerving familiarity through the devastated rooms, his polished shoes treading on dust and rubble. He didn't stop until he reached the doorway of the study. He stood there, his back to Liam, and surveyed the room in silence. Liam's heart was a deafening drum in his ears. He stared at the wall, at the section he had torn apart. In the darkness, he couldn't tell how obvious the damage was. He held his breath, waiting for the accusation, for the mask to drop. He felt like a mouse being calmly observed by a snake, paralyzed and waiting for the inevitable strike. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Dr. Alves finally turned around, his face an unreadable mask. He didn't mention the wall. Instead, he looked directly at Liam, his cold eyes seeming to peer directly into his soul. "I've been thinking, Mr. Costa," he said, his voice dropping to a more intimate, conspiratorial tone. "This project is clearly too much for one man. It's not what you signed up for. And frankly, my company is considering another direction for this property." He paused, letting the words hang in the dead air. "So I am prepared to make you an offer. We'll buy you out of your contract, 10,000 rees, a generous sum for your troubles. You can take the money, go back to the city, and forget this place ever existed." The offer was an insult, a pittance, but Liam knew it wasn't a negotiation. It was a command disguised as a choice, a test. The doctor was probing, trying to see if Liam knew what he was really sitting on. Liam stood frozen, his mind racing. 10,000 reis was nothing compared to the fortune hidden under his cot, but it was a ticket out, a way to escape this place and the monster standing in front of him. But he knew it wasn't that simple. His hesitation, the frantic calculations visible in his eyes, was an answer in itself. Dr. Alves' smile tightened, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift, but Liam saw it. The doctor's eyes hardened. "You should consider it carefully," he said, his voice losing its fabricated warmth and taking on a sharp, metallic edge. He took a step closer, invading Liam's personal space. "This is a very isolated place, Mr. Costa, very remote." He gestured to the crumbling ceiling, the dark woods pressing in on all sides. Unstable structures, venomous snakes. "The wilderness here is not forgiving." He paused, his gaze dropping for a split second toward the shack where Sophia slept. "Accidents happen. Tragedies. A man with a young daughter should be especially careful." The threat, when it came, was as cold and sharp as a shard of ice pressed against his skin. The casual, almost throwaway mention of Sophia was a direct, unmistakable message. It wasn't a warning about the farm, it was a warning about Dr. Alves himself. The air was squeezed from Liam's lungs. He felt a terror so profound, so primal, that it almost buckled his knees. This man would not hesitate to harm his child. He would erase them both and bury them here, just as his father had buried the original owners of this land. Dr. Alves held his gaze for a moment longer, letting the poison of his words sink in. Then, with another thin, chilling smile, he turned and walked away. "So I'll be in touch in a few days to hear your decision," he called over his shoulder, his voice once again light and businesslike. Liam stood motionless, listening to the man's footsteps fade, followed by the soft thump of the car door and the roar of the engine starting. As the sound of the Mercedes faded into the distance, it left behind a silence that was 1,000 times more terrifying than the noise of the jungle. The night was no longer just empty. It was filled with the presence of a known evil. Liam stumbled back to the shack, his body trembling uncontrollably. The veiled threat echoed in his mind, replaying over and over. A man with a young daughter should be careful. He was trapped. The gold was a path to freedom, but a path lined with landmines. The documents were proof of a horrifying crime, but using them would be signing his and Sophia's death warrant. He looked at the lump under the cot where the gold and the diary were hidden. a fortune and a curse, intertwined. He was standing at a crossroads, with wolves on every path. He could take the 10,000 reais and run, hoping Alves would let them go. Or he could try to use the gold to escape, knowing the doctor would hunt them to the ends of the earth. Or he could fight. The weight of the choice was suffocating. He knelt on the dirt floor, the damp earth cold against his knees. The faint scent of mold and decay seemed to mock him, a reminder of the tomb he had willingly walked into. He had come here to save his daughter, and instead, he had led her into the jaws of a monster far more dangerous than any landlord or debt collector. The secret in his possession was powerful enough to destroy a wicked empire built on blood, but the act of revealing it felt like pulling the pin on a grenade while holding his own child in his arms. The silence of the shack pressed in on him, broken only by the soft, steady breathing of his sleeping daughter. Her life was in his hands. Everything came down to what he did next. What would you do in Liam's place? Would you run with the dirty money and pray for anonymity? Or would you risk everything, your life and your child's, to unleash the truth and fight for a justice that was 70 years overdue? The engine's roar faded into the oppressive symphony of the jungle, but for Liam, the silence it left behind was 1,000 times louder. It was a vacuum, filled only by the echo of Dr. Alves's final, chilling words. Accidents happen. The threat was no longer veiled. It was a physical presence in the shack, a cold, heavy shroud that settled over him, suffocating him. He stood frozen in the doorway, his body rigid with a terror so profound it felt like paralysis. Every nerve ending screamed at him to run, to grab Sophia and disappear into the night, but his feet felt as if they were bolted to the damp earth. He was a fly caught in a web 70 years in the making, and the spider had just finished admiring its catch. He felt his heart hammering a frantic, useless rhythm against his ribs, each beat a countdown to a disaster he had personally engineered. The scent of mold in the air now smelled like the grave that Alves had so casually prepared for him and his daughter. The night was no longer just dark, it was predatory. Liam stumbled back into the hovel, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He felt the cold, clammy sweat on his skin, the frantic pulse beating in his throat. He sank to the dirt floor, the grit pressing into his knees, his entire body trembling with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. He was trapped. The thought slammed into him again and again, a physical blow. Running was impossible. Alves would hunt them down. His face, his name, were known. Staying was suicide. The 10,000 real offer was not a buyout. It was a test, and he had failed it with his terrified hesitation. A wave of gut-wrenching nausea swept over him. He had faced eviction, starvation, and the abyss of grief, but this was a new dimension of fear. This was not the indifferent cruelty of poverty. This was the focused, intelligent, and patient malice of a predator who had all the power. He stared at the dark lump under the cot where the evidence lay hidden, its presence a burning curse that had sealed their fate. He looked over at Sophia, who had stirred but thankfully not woken, her small form curled on the wretched mattress. The sight of her peaceful, innocent face was a knife in his gut. He had brought her here. He had followed a siren song of false hope straight into a monster's lair. A single tear, hot and sharp, escaped his eye and traced a path through the grime on his cheek. The weight of his failure was absolute, a black hole of despair that threatened to swallow him whole. But then, something else stirred within the depths of his terror, a different feeling, hot and sharp. It was rage, a primal, protective fury that burned away the paralysis. They would not take his daughter. They would not erase them like a footnote in their bloody family history. He would not be another unfall in their ledger. The decision was made not in his mind but in his soul. He would not run, he would not surrender. He would fight. He didn't know how, but the paralysis was broken, replaced by a cold, desperate resolve. His mind, now clear and sharp with adrenaline, raced through the scant details of his surroundings. He was isolated, but was he completely alone? The thought sparked a memory, faint and almost forgotten. A few days ago, while scavenging for firewood at the far edge of the property line, he had stopped and stared into the distance. He had seen it for just a moment before it vanished. A thin, almost invisible plume of wood smoke rising miles away against the vast green canopy. At the time, he had dismissed it. Now it was a beacon, a desperate, insane long shot, but it was the only shot he had. He had to find the source of that smoke. He had to find another human being. He looked at Sophia again, his heart tearing in two. Leaving her here, alone and undefended, felt like a monstrous betrayal. But staying here, waiting for Alves to return, was a death sentence. He had to move. He had to take the risk. His hand touched her cheek. So soft, so warm. "I'll be back, sweetie," he whispered into the darkness, a promise that felt as heavy as a prayer. With a final, agonizing look at his daughter, Liam slipped out of the shack and into the pre-dawn gloom. The air was cool and heavy with dew, and the world was painted in shades of grey and black. He moved with a speed he didn't know he possessed, his body fueled by pure, unadulterated fear. He ran, not on the dirt track, but plunging directly into the dense, tangled undergrowth that bordered the farm. Thorns tore at his shirt and skin, leaving fiery trails of pain. Wet leaves slapped against his face, their moisture cold like a dead man's touch. The sounds of his own passage, the cracking of twigs underfoot, his own ragged breathing, were deafeningly loud in the silence. He felt like a clumsy beast, advertising his presence to every predator in the jungle, both animal and human. He pushed the thought away, focusing only on the direction of the smoke he had seen days ago, a compass point of pure hope in his terrified mind. His only guide was instinct, a desperate gamble against the rising sun. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every rustle in the leaves a footstep. He imagined Alves's men already here, stalking him through the trees, their faces cold and merciless. The paranoia was a living thing, a creature riding on his back, whispering of failure and death. The physical exertion was brutal. His lungs burned, his muscles screamed in protest. But he didn't slow down. He scrambled down ravines slick with mud, the smell of damp earth and decay filling his nostrils. He pushed through curtains of thick vines that snagged and pulled at him like grasping hands, trying to hold him back, to keep him within the cursed grounds of Sombra Verde. He felt a sharp pain in his palm, and looked down to see a long, deep gash from a splintered branch, blood welling up, dark in the dim light. He ignored it, the pain a distant, unimportant signal compared to the fire of terror and resolve that propelled him forward. He was running not just for his life, but for a justice he hadn't even known existed a day ago. After what felt like an eternity of tearing through the wilderness, his body screaming for rest, he stumbled into a small clearing and froze. There it was. Not smoke this time, but a light. A single, small yellow square of light from a window, flickering softly in the deep twilight that precedes the dawn. And with it, a smell that was so normal, so human, it almost made him weep with relief. The rich, comforting scent of brewing coffee and burning wood. He saw the source, a tiny, humble shack, barely more than one room, but unlike the hovel at Sombra Verde, it was whole. It was a home. The roof was patched but solid. The walls were straight, and a small, neat garden grew beside it. This was a place of life, not decay. It was an island of order in a sea of chaos. He stood at the edge of the trees, panting, his heart a wild drum in his chest. He had made it, but now came the second gamble. Who was inside? Was this an ally, or just another part of the nightmare? He took a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic pounding of his heart, and stepped out of the tree line. His appearance was shocking, he knew. His clothes were torn and stained with mud and blood, his face scratched, his eyes wild with fear. He looked like a madman, a fugitive. As he drew closer, he saw a figure sitting on the small, crude porch, a steaming mug held in his hands. It was an old man, his form a silhouette against the light from the open door. He didn't seem startled by Liam's sudden, dramatic appearance. He just sat there, watching him approach, his posture calm and steady. Liam's throat was dry, his voice a stranger to him when he finally managed to speak, a hoarse croak. "Hello? Please. I need help." The old man slowly lowered his mug, the scraping sound loud in the quiet air. He squinted, his eyes seeming to take in every detail of Liam's desperate state. Then he nodded slowly, a gesture of profound, weary understanding. "I know," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble like stones in a riverbed. "Sit." The old man's name was Jonas. He was a relic, a man who seemed carved from the very earth he lived on. His skin was a roadmap of wrinkles, tanned to the color of old leather by a lifetime under the sun. He was stooped and thin, but his hands, though gnarled with arthritis, were steady, and his eyes were ageless. They were dark and sharp, and they held a deep, profound sadness mixed with an unyielding strength. He gestured to a rough-hewn wooden stool on the porch. Liam collapsed onto it, his legs giving way. Jonas pushed the steaming mug of coffee into his hands. The heat was a shock, a jolt of life that travelled up his arms. The smell was rich and strong, and the first sip burned his throat, but it was the most grounding, real thing he had felt in days. He looked at Jonas, whose gaze was steady and patient, as if he had all the time in the world, as if he had been waiting for this moment, for this terrified stranger to appear out of the darkness. He felt a flicker of trust, a fragile seedling in the wasteland of his fear. Jonas didn't press. He just sat, sipping his coffee, letting the silence stretch. And in that silence, the dam of Liam's terror and isolation finally broke. The words came tumbling out, a frantic, desperate torrent. He told him everything. The ad, the ruin, the despair, the false wall in the study, the hollow sound, the adrenaline of the discovery. He described the parcels wrapped in oilcloth, the impossible weight, the soft, sinister glow of the gold. He described the eagle and the swastika, the name on the diary, the documents in the folder. He spoke of Dr. Alves's visit, the coldness in his eyes, the veiled threat against Sophia that was no veil at all. He felt a profound, cleansing relief as he spoke, the act of sharing the horrifying secret, lifting a fraction of its crushing weight from his soul. He wasn't alone with it anymore. He laid the entire nightmare at the old man's feet, his voice finally cracking with exhaustion and fear. "He's going to kill us," Liam whispered, the admission hanging in the cold morning air. For a long moment, Jonas was silent, his dark eyes fixed on some distant point in the past. Liam's frantic confession hadn't shocked him. It had confirmed something. He finally turned his gaze back to Liam, a deep, ancient sorrow swirling in their depths. "You are not the first person to disturb that house," Jonas said, his voice low and heavy. "But you are the first to find its heart." Liam, confused, simply stared. He didn't understand. Jonas leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his expression hardening. "Tell me the name," he commanded, his voice suddenly sharp, intense. First the name in the diary. Liam's mind fumbled for a second. "Werner," he stammered. "Horst Werner." At the sound of the name, a visible transformation occurred in Jonas. The weary sadness in his eyes was instantly extinguished, replaced by a burning, black fire of pure, undiluted hatred. His gnarled hands, which had been resting on his knees, clenched into tight, white-knuckled fists. The air grew cold, charged with a 70-year-old rage. "Horst Werner," Jonas repeated, the name a curse on his tongue, tasting of ash and blood. "The German, the devil." He spoke as if the man were standing right there. He looked past Liam, his gaze fixed on the distant, dark mass of the Sombra Verde property. "This land, it was not always Sombra Verde," he began, his voice thick with a grief that was still raw, still bleeding. "It was called Val da Luz, Valley of Light. It was not one farm. It was our community, my family and a dozen others. We were born here. Our parents were born here. We worked the earth. We raised our children. It was a good life." As he spoke, Liam could almost see it, a ghost of a vibrant past laid over the present-day ruin. The scent of coffee was replaced by the phantom smell of cooking fires and flowering trees. The silence was filled with the imagined sounds of children's laughter. Jonas was not just telling a story. He was opening a wound, revealing the sacred ground upon which the atrocity had been built. Liam felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Jonas's eyes became distant, lost in the horror of his memory. Then he came, Werner, with his money and his cold eyes. At first, he offered to buy the land. We refused. This was our home. It was not for sale. Jonas's voice grew harder, each word a chip of stone. When we refused, he showed his true face. He returned not with money, but with men, Kapangas, thugs with rifles and machetes, their faces empty of mercy. He paused, taking a ragged breath, the memory of physical torment. They came in the night. There was shouting, the sound of gunfire, so loud it shook the ground, the smell of kerosene, and then fire. They burned our houses. They shot our animals. He closed his eyes, his face a mask of agony. They shot our people. I was just a boy, 10 years old, the same as your daughter. My father pushed me out a window and told me to run, to hide in the forest and not make a sound. He was no longer just an old man. He was that terrified 10-year-old boy again, watching his world burn. I hid in the hollow of a great Samauma tree, Jonas continued, his voice a raw whisper. I watched them drag my father from our burning home. I heard my mother's screams. I watched the German officer, Horst Werner, stand there, a pistol in his hand, a calm expression on his face, as if he were simply tidying up. The old man's body was racked with a silent sob, a tremor of grief that had been suppressed for a lifetime. I was the only one who saw, the only one who escaped. The official reports called it a land dispute, a fire, a tragedy. The police were paid. The records were buried. They all vanished, all except me, the boy who watched the devil cleanse the Valley of Light and rename it the Green Shadow. The final piece of the puzzle slammed into place in Liam's mind with the force of a physical blow. The ledger entries, Unfall, Verschwunden. This was the truth behind those cold, clinical words. He was sitting with the sole survivor of a forgotten massacre. Liam felt his own grief, his own fears, shrink in the shadow of Jonas's monumental tragedy. The gold, the diary. It was no longer just a secret. It was Jonas's story. It was the only proof of his family's existence, the only chance for a justice that was nearly a century overdue. Alves, Liam said, the name tasting like poison. Dr. Alves is his son. Jonas nodded, his eyes snapping back to the present, the fire of rage returning. Yes, Klaus. He has spent his life laundering that blood money, building his empire on the bones of my family. For years, he has been trying to clear the title of this land completely. There are legal tangles, ghosts in the paperwork that I have helped keep alive. He needs to sell this land to a foreign mining corporation. It is the final step of his plan. Jonas leaned closer, his eyes boring into Liam's. But to do that, he must destroy all evidence of the original crime. He must find his father's gold, and he must burn that diary. That is why he hired you. A desperate man with no connections. He thought you would never find it, but you did. Jonas's gaze was sharp, urgent, and now he knows you have found it. His threat was not a warning for the future. It was a promise of what is to come, today. The certainty in the old man's voice sent a fresh wave of ice-cold terror through Liam. He will not make the same mistake twice. He will not leave a witness this time. You cannot go back to that shack. He will be back, and not alone. Liam's blood ran cold. Sophia. His mind screamed her name. He started to stand up, a frantic energy seizing him. My daughter! She's still there! Jonas put a firm, surprisingly strong hand on his arm, holding him in place. Listen to me, he commanded, his voice cutting through Liam's panic. Going back now is what he expects. We need a plan. There is a way out. The old man's urgency was a lifeline. Liam forced himself to listen, to push down the tidal wave of panic that threatened to drown him. He had to think. He had to save her. There was no room for fear now, only for action. Jonas spoke quickly, his voice a low, urgent whisper. The main house, your study. In the old days, beneath the floor, there was a root cellar. The entrance was hidden under a rug. My father showed it to me. He drew a crude map in the dirt with a stick. The cellar connects to a collapsed tunnel, a drainage system that leads out into the woods, not 50 meters from here. It was an escape route. It is your only chance. As Jonas finished speaking, a new sound sliced through the morning air, tearing the fragile peace to shreds. It was the sound they had been dreading, the distant angry roar of an engine moving fast, too fast, and then another, a heavier, grittier sound. 2 vehicles. They were coming back. Liam's heart stopped. The sound was not the cautious approach of last night. It was an assault, a cavalry charge. Panic, absolute and overwhelming, exploded in his chest. Sophia. He shot to his feet. Jonas's map, his plan, everything forgotten in the face of that one single, terrifying reality. He ran. He didn't say goodbye to Jonas. He just turned and plunged back into the woods, his body moving on pure, primal instinct. The terror for his daughter was a physical force, propelling him forward. blinding him to the pain of branches whipping his face, of thorns tearing at his arms. His lungs burned, a fire in his chest. His only thought was Sophia's name, a silent, desperate scream in his mind. The roar of the engines grew louder, culminating in the squeal of tires on gravel as they skidded to a stop. He was close, too close, and too far. He burst through the tree line at the edge of the property, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard he thought it would break. He saw them. A black pickup truck was parked next to Alves's sedan. Two men were climbing out of the truck. They were big, thick-set, their faces hard and brutal. They were not lawyers. They were not inspectors. They were thugs, soldiers in Alves's private war, and they had come to finish the job. One of the men, a bull-necked brute with a shaved head, strode toward the main house, his hand resting on something bulky tucked into the waistband of his jeans. The other lingered by the truck, and then Liam saw her. Sophia. She was standing by the shack, her small face pale with confusion and fear, a half-eaten biscuit in her hand. The man by the truck had a hold of her arm. Liam's vision went red. A guttural sound of pure rage escaped his throat. The man with the shaved head, assuming Liam was hiding in the main house, bellowed, his voice echoing across the ruined farm. "Alves is tired of waiting. You have 1 hour, bring out the box and everything in it. If you don't—" He paused, and the other man gave Sophia's arm a cruel shake, making her cry out, "The girl pays the price." The threat was a physical impact, knocking the air from Liam's lungs. He was caught in a perfect, horrifying trap, his daughter the bait. He was exposed, outnumbered, and on the verge of losing everything. But in that instant of pure terror, he saw it, an opening. The thug's attention was divided. The one with Sophia was distracted, scanning the main house. The other had his back turned, facing the ruin. They had made a mistake. They assumed he was a coward, hiding. They didn't know he was right there, watching. An insane, desperate plan formed in his mind. A gamble with impossible odds. It was now or never. He broke from the cover of the trees, his feet silent on the soft earth. He ran not with the frantic noise of his earlier flight, but with the deadly quiet of a predator. He moved in a low crouch, using the overgrown weeds and scattered debris as cover, circling around toward the back of the shack. His heart was a silent, frantic explosion in his chest. Every beat screamed Sophia's name. He could feel the thugs' presence, their casual brutality a palpable force in the air. He was a lamb walking into a wolf pack, but a lamb with fire in its eyes. He reached the back of the shack, his body pressed against the rotting planks. He could hear Sophia crying softly, the sound a razor blade against his heart. He peered around the corner. The man holding her had turned his head, yelling something to his partner. This was it, his only chance. Liam exploded from behind the shack. He covered the 10 feet between them in a heartbeat. The thug heard him at the last second, his eyes widening in surprise. Liam didn't hesitate. He grabbed Sophia, pulling her free, his other hand clamping over her mouth to stifle her scream of shock. He practically threw her behind him, towards the relative safety of the shack's interior, whispering her name like a prayer. "Sophia, it's me. Get inside, now." He then launched himself at the thug, a wild, desperate tackle driven by pure adrenaline. He slammed his shoulder into the man's midsection, sending them both crashing to the ground in a tangle of limbs. The man let out a grunt of pain and surprise, his grip on his weapon momentarily forgotten. The element of surprise wouldn't last. Liam scrambled to his feet, ignoring the searing pain in his shoulder. "Inside!" he screamed at Sophia, who was frozen in the doorway, her eyes wide with terror. He darted into the shack, his movements frantic. He kicked aside the moldy mattress, his hands finding the cold metal of the lockbox and the heavy, dense weight of the single gold bar. He scooped them up. The other thug was yelling now, running toward them. "He's in the shed!" There was no time. Liam grabbed Sophia's hand, pulling her with him. "We have to run, sweetie. Stay with me." He burst out the back of the shack, away from the approaching thug, and sprinted toward the gaping maw of the ruined main house. The sounds of heavy, angry footsteps pounded on the dirt behind them, getting closer. He could hear the men yelling, their voices filled with rage at his audacity. He was no longer the prey. He was the fuse, and he had just lit the bomb. The chase was on. He half-dragged, half-carried a sobbing Sophia into the main house, the familiar smell of dust and decay a strange comfort. He didn't stop in the main hall, but went straight for the study, the place where this nightmare had begun. The hole in the false wall seemed to watch them, a dark, accusing eye. "Where's the door, Daddy?" Sophia cried, her voice trembling. "Jonas said—" Liam scanned the floor frantically, his mind racing, the thug's footsteps echoing just outside the room. There, under a tattered, rotting piece of carpet. He kicked it aside, revealing a dark, square outline in the floorboards and a tarnished iron ring. He jammed his fingers through the ring and pulled with all his might. The trapdoor resisted, swollen with a century of damp, and then gave way with a groan of splintering wood, revealing a square of perfect, subterranean blackness. The cold, musty smell of a tomb rushed up to meet them, the scent of damp earth and long-forgotten time. "He's in here!" a voice bellowed from the hallway. Heavy footsteps thundered toward the study. There was no time left. Liam looked down into the terrifying darkness, then at his daughter's terrified face. "I'll catch you," he promised. His voice strained. He lifted her and lowered her into the opening. For a heart-stopping second, her hands slipped, and she fell with a small scream into the black. He didn't wait to hear her land. He dropped the heavy lockbox and the gold bar down after her, and then swung his own body into the hole, just as the two thugs burst into the room. Their surprised shouts were the last thing he heard as he pulled the heavy trapdoor down over his head. The world was instantly plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness and a sudden, shocking silence. Above, he could hear the men's heavy boots stomping on the floorboards directly over them, their angry, muffled shouts echoing through the wood. They were trapped in the belly of the earth, in the grave of the past, with the monsters raging just inches away. The darkness was absolute, a physical entity that swallowed sound and light. Liam pulled the heavy trapdoor shut, and the world vanished. The angry, muffled shouts and the thunderous stomping of boots from above were the only proof that their hunters still existed. A primal rage echoing through the thick wood just inches from his head. He held his breath, his heart a frantic, panicked drum against his ribs. He felt for Sophia, her small, trembling body a fragile presence in the suffocating blackness. "I'm here, sweetie," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp in the silence of the tomb. He lowered himself down the crude, slick rungs of an iron ladder, his feet finally touching the cold, packed earth floor. The air was frigid, ancient, thick with the smell of deep, wet earth and the faintest hint of century-old decay. He found Sophia's hand, small and icy, and clutched it. He located the lockbox and the gold, their combined weight a terrible and necessary anchor to their grim reality. Following Jonas's map burned into his mind, he felt along the wall for the opening. The tunnel was horrifyingly narrow, the rough stone scraping his back as they shuffled through the oppressive dark. Finally, a faint circle of grey light appeared. Freedom. They crawled out into the dense woods, emerging like ghosts from the earth, mud-streaked and gasping for air, as the sounds of rage faded behind them, swallowed by the very ground that had saved them. They stumbled through the undergrowth, the first light of dawn painting the sky in pale, indifferent shades of grey. The single point of yellow light from Jonas's shack was a lighthouse in a storm of terror, pulling them forward. Jonas was waiting on the porch, as if he had never moved, his face a grim mask carved from ancient wood. He didn't waste time on questions. His sharp eyes took in their state in a single sweeping glance, the mud from the tunnel caked on their skin, Sophia's silent tears, the way Liam clutched the black metal box to his chest as if it were his own heart. He simply nodded, a gesture of profound, sorrowful confirmation, and ushered them inside. The tiny shack was transformed. It was no longer just a humble home, it was a wartime command post, the final bastion in a 70-year struggle. Jonas moved with a deliberate, urgent energy that defied his age, crossing to a small, dusty table in the corner. Upon it sat an ancient, black rotary phone, its cord frayed, a relic from a forgotten era. Jonas picked up the heavy bakelite receiver, his finger poised over the dial. In that moment, he was not a frail elder. He was a general about to commit his final reserves to battle. He met Liam's eyes, and in that silent glance, a pact of blood and vengeance was sealed. Jonas's gnarled finger moved with a slow, deliberate certainty, the whirring of the rotary dial filling the tense silence of the shack. Whir, click, whir, click. Each turn of the dial was the sound of a key turning in a long-sealed tomb. The phone on the other end must have rung for what felt like an eternity before a sharp, female voice answered. Jonas began to speak, his own voice low and urgent, dispensing with all pleasantries. He spoke a language of ghosts, using names Liam didn't recognize and referencing dates from before he was born, land grants, registry numbers, forgotten legal challenges that were Jonas's life's work. Then his voice grew hard as stone. Horst Werner, he said, the name a blade. Val de Luce. He listened for a moment, then continued. There is new evidence. Undeniable. I have his diary. His confession. The financial ledger. He glanced at Liam, at the black box. And the gold. The Nazi gold. It is here. Now. The person on the other end was Dr. Arana, a formidable human rights lawyer from the state capital, a woman who had built her career fighting the lingering shadows of the military dictatorship. Jonas's final words were a quiet declaration of war. We have the monster's son, Klaus Alves, cornered, but he is a monster too. We need you. Now Artie, he hung up. A fuse had been lit hundreds of miles away. The lawyer's instructions were simple and terrifyingly absolute. Do not move. Do not make a sound. Bar the door. I am coming, and I am not coming alone. The hours that followed were the longest of Liam's life. The fire of adrenaline faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a raw, exposed nerve of fear that twitched with every jungle sound. Jonas stood watch at the single small window, a silent, unmoving sentinel, his ancient single-barrel shotgun resting against the doorframe. Liam focused on Sophia. He gently cleaned the streaks of mud and tears from her face with a damp rag, his heart aching with every exhausted shiver that ran through her small body. She finally succumbed to a deep, traumatized sleep in his arms, her breath a soft, rhythmic puff against his chest. He carefully laid her on Jonas's narrow cot, covering her with a thin, worn blanket. Then he sat at the small wooden table, the lockbox before him. He ran his hand over its cold, scarred metal. Inside lay a fortune that could have saved him, a history that had almost killed him, and a truth that might now set them all free. He and Jonas waited in the quiet gloom, two men from different worlds, bound together by an act of violence from a lifetime ago. The jungle outside was no longer a threat. It was their shield. Dusk bled purple and orange through the dense jungle canopy when the sound finally came. It was not the aggressive roar of Alves's thugs, but the low, subtle crunch of tires moving slowly on a hidden access road Jonas knew of. Liam's heart leaped into his throat, a frantic bird beating against the cage of his ribs. A single headlight beam cut through the trees, then was immediately extinguished. Then another. It wasn't one car. It was a convoy. Two unmarked black sedans and a larger windowless van rolled to a quiet stop in the clearing. Their engines cut simultaneously. Doors opened with a hushed efficiency. Men emerged, not the rumpled local police Liam might have expected, but disciplined, grim-faced professionals in dark tactical gear, automatic weapons held at a low ready. On their sleeves, the insignia of the Policia Federal. They moved with a silent, predatory grace, securing the perimeter of the tiny shack in seconds. From the lead sedan stepped a woman. She was in her late 50s, dressed in a practical dark suit, her graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her face was sharp, intelligent, etched with the fatigue of countless battles fought in courtrooms and dusty archives. This was Dr. Arana. She strode toward the shack, her intense gaze ignoring the heavily armed men, locking onto Jonas, and then onto Liam in the doorway, clutching the box. Justice, it turned out, arrived without sirens. The interior of Jonas's shack, usually lit by a single flickering kerosene lamp, was now starkly illuminated by the harsh, white glare of the federal agents' powerful flashlights. The tiny room felt like a stage, the air thick with anticipation. With the taciturn federal commander and Dr. Arana watching, their faces etched with a grim focus, Liam placed the mud-streaked lockbox on the small wooden table. The metallic thud seemed to echo with the finality of a gavel strike. His hands were shaking again, not with fear this time, but with the sheer, crushing weight of the historical moment. He lifted the lid. He carefully removed the contents one by one. First, the leather-bound diary of Horst Werner, its cover cracked like dry earth. Second, the bulging folder of yellowed documents, the meticulous ledger of a forgotten genocide. Dr. Arana produced a pair of white latex gloves from her briefcase and handled the papers with the reverence an archaeologist gives to a priceless, fragile artifact. Finally, Liam unwrapped the dirty rag from the last item. He placed the gold bar on the table. In the clinical light, the stamped eagle and swastika seemed to gleam with a fresh, malevolent energy. The commander stared at it and let out a low, disbelieving whistle. The ghosts of Val-de-Luz were no longer whispering. They were screaming for justice. The operation was a masterpiece of silent, overwhelming force. Liam and Sophia remained with two agents at Jonas's shack, the distant, silent hub of the unfolding drama. Dr. Arana and the federal commander used Jonas's hand-drawn maps and Liam's fresh intelligence to coordinate the assault with chilling precision. The primary target was not the ruined farm, but a luxurious modern villa Dr. Alves owned on a nearby lakefront, his private weekend retreat. Liam would later see the footage, captured by a national news helicopter that had been expertly tipped off by Dr. Arana's office. He watched it on a small television in a sterile federal safehouse, the images surreal and deeply satisfying. Heavily armed agents rappelling down the walls of the glass and steel mansion in the dead of night. A quiet, contained explosive charge blowing open a reinforced door. And then, the shot that led every news broadcast for weeks, Dr. Klaus Alves, the powerful, untouchable lawyer and political fixer, being led out in handcuffs and silk pajamas, his handsome face a mask of pure, incredulous rage. His empire of blood money and intimidation, so carefully constructed over decades, shattered in the space of a few televised minutes. The name Horst Werner, dredged from dormant war crime archives, was suddenly on every lip, a scandal that echoed across the globe. The legal storm that followed was of epic proportions. Dr. Alves's arrest triggered a cascade of investigations, toppling a corrupt network of politicians and businessmen. The diary, authenticated by international experts, and the ledger, cross-referenced with newly uncovered Swiss bank records, laid bare a 70-year conspiracy. The story of the Nazi gold and the Val-de-Luz massacre became a matter of global importance. Restitution organizations became involved, and the vast, hidden fortune of Horst Werner, including the gold still sealed within the wall, was seized. The fraudulent land title for Fazenda Sombra Verde, built on a foundation of murder and bribery, was officially nullified by the nation's highest court. In a landmark ruling, the land was restored and placed into a perpetual trust for the descendants of the original families, to be administered by a vindicated Jonas. For his critical role in uncovering the truth and the mortal danger he and his daughter had faced, the state granted Liam a substantial official reward. It wasn't blood money, it was justice money, a sum from a fund for whistleblowers that was so large it felt abstract. It was enough to erase his past, secure Sophia's future, and begin a new life, utterly free from the spectre of debt and fear forever. 1 year later, the air is warm and smells not of mold and decay, but of freshly cut cedar wood and the rich scent of brewing coffee. Liam stands on the wide porch of a new house, a sturdy, beautiful home he designed and built with his own 2 hands. His hands are calloused again, strong and capable, the familiar and satisfying roughness a testament to his renewed purpose. This house stands on a plot of land gifted to him by the Val-de-Luz Community Trust, a place earned not with money, but with courage. In the yard below, a tire swing, an exact replica of the one from Sophia's old drawing, hangs from the branch of a massive samauma tree. The sound that fills the air is not the mournful wail of distant sirens or the maddening drip of water, but the bright, carefree laughter of children. Sophia, her face alight with a joy he thought he might never see again, swings high, pushed by Jonas, whose ancient face is cracked into a rare, wide smile. Liam watches them, a feeling of peace so profound it almost brings him to his knees. He is no longer a victim of circumstance, a man fleeing his failures. He is the architect of his own redemption, a man who chose to stay and help rebuild a broken place, finding a true home in the very land that had once promised only ruin. The table is long, made of polished jatoba wood that Liam finished himself, its surface warm and smooth beneath his hands. It is filled with food, roasted chicken, fresh vegetables from the burgeoning community garden, steaming bowls of rice and beans. A feast. Seated around it are Jonas, his eyes bright with a light Liam had never seen before, and the first few families who have begun to return to the reclaimed valley, their faces etched with a tentative but growing hope. Sophia sits beside Liam, her plate piled high, chattering excitedly about her day at the small school they had just opened in a newly renovated building. Liam looks at her confident smile and shining eyes, and feels the last remnants of the cold, tight knot of grief and shame in his chest finally dissolve into nothingness. This was the life he had dreamed of giving her, a life not of immense wealth, but of profound richness, of warmth, community, and belonging. He had journeyed into the heart of a 70-year-old darkness and emerged not unscathed, but whole. His story was a testament to the fact that even in the deepest shadows, the courage of one person can drag a monstrous truth into the cleansing light. What stories of justice are waiting to be uncovered in your own world? If you believe that truth must prevail, subscribe to our channel and join us for more incredible stories of resilience and redemption.